Nice to be here. Thank you very much for coming. Actually, I'm very pleased to see so many here in the hall because there's a lot of competition with 8 tracks. So really thank you for choosing to come into this room for this slot. It's really nice to see so many of you here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, well, maybe some of you have heard of Shape Up and you know about the book, yeah? But it's not really about Shape Up and it's not really about a particular methodology. What I'd like to do is basically talk about some of the things that are happening to a lot of us in our day, yeah? Things that are going wrong, things that are bad experiences, things that are difficult in our process of working together with the other functions inside of the organization, and see if we might get some clarity around why that is and start to imagine what some different possibilities could look like and what we could even do as next steps, right? And some of that might mean doing what is in something in a book like Shape Up, but it also might just mean seeing some new principles or having some new ideas. So to start off with, I just want to show you some cartoons. Okay, so very often, someone from the product team, someone from the business side, or a customer says, hey, why aren't we finished on this thing yet? Yeah, why aren't we done? And for those of us on the technical side, the answer is usually something like this. It's a little bit more complicated than it seems. And this, on the one side, we sometimes think that this is just a fact of life, that tech is complicated, that code can be complicated, and it can be like this. But at the same time, these things have causes. We get into the situation where we thought we would already be done or, looks easy enough, right? And then we discover it's more complicated than we thought. And when we get into that situation, it's not actually just a fact of life, but it has to do with how the project started and how much clarity we had about what we were getting into when we began the project. And if we look at the beginnings of our projects, we can see a lot of disconnects. We can see things like this, where the designer comes and they say, I have this, Figma file with 30 different states and everything is perfectly designed. Everything is exactly as it should be, right? And we think, so does it mean that we're ready to go? And the engineers look at it and we say, no way. We can't actually build it that way. That's not actually technically possible. That's not as easy as you think, and so on, right? It can also happen the other way, where instead of getting this Figma file with every single detail spelled out, that a product comes to us or somebody from the business side comes to us and they say, here's the new thing that we're going to build. It's going to be so great. It's going to earn so much money. It's really going to move the needle. And it has a lot of explanations about why this makes sense from a business point of view, why the customer wants it, why so many people are going to use it, but it doesn't actually tell us what to do, right? We look at that and we say, okay, sounds great. We should add a new super dashboard. We should build the new report, but what does it actually mean? What are we actually going to start building when the clock starts to tick, right? Even when we have a single, well thought out, meaningful concept, right? Of here is why we're going to do it, here's the interactions, here is the technical architecture behind, this is how the pieces fit together, this is something that we can do that's going to make sense. Even if we come to that point where we say, yes, this is a good idea and we know what we're getting into, let's start the project. In most teams today, the way that that gets turned into work, the way that that gets turned into the tasks that we actually spend our days doing is by putting it through a paper shredder, right? So this is, maybe you heard of something called Scrum, and this is the mechanism, right? If we were the genius designers at IKEA who create a perfect modular system where you have many small pieces and then you open the instruction manual and it tells you how to put the pieces together so that you have your new wardrobe or TV stand or whatever. If we were such geniuses, then maybe this method would work. But actually figuring out how to break the concept apart into completely isolated, separate pieces of work and then have them come together again in the end the way that we expect, this is not what's happening when we define tickets. People are taking an individual ticket and looking at it, and the context isn't there, right? There isn't enough of an understanding of what is around the ticket. So it means that there's a lot of questions, there's getting stuck, there's waiting for an answer, there's building something without knowing all of the trade-offs. And then, of course, we have all kinds of problems because of that. We have quality problems where a lot of disconnected pieces, all the work is getting added into the product, but it's not becoming a meaningful whole. It's not one concept that really makes sense as a unit, right? But it's just a lot of stuff that's getting done. And because of that, you've probably had the experience too, where you're in the middle of a project or a project has been dragging, and we look at all of those tickets on the board. And instead of just seeing this progress of, it's moving from to do to in progress to done, what we're seeing is that a lot of individual pieces of work are getting done. But if we step back, we cannot say, oh, this is clearly adding up to something. Now the project is really getting done. Very often, the more tickets that are getting done, kind of the further away the actual completion of the project feels to be, right? Because the scope is getting bigger and the complexity is getting bigger, and it's not adding up to something. So, and the last thing, of course, is that a lot of us are struggling with a calendar that, if it doesn't look like this, it certainly feels like this, right? Yeah, where we would like to be able to use our brains, we would like to be able to think, to go deeply into the work and solve a cool technical problem or put together a new concept for how the architecture should work that's going to be better than before. But we never have that deep time because we're having so many meetings, and a lot of these meetings, it's not just the general culture of too many meetings. A lot of it has to do with the different rituals that are in place in our teams, like that we have to have a debrief for this, or we have to have a retro for that, and a sprint planning for this. And there's so much ritual that there isn't time for real work. So when I talk about all these things, does anyone recognize what I'm talking about? Yeah? Okay, good. I see some movement. That's nice. Okay. So these are things that are going on. And a big focus of my work over the last 20 plus years has been actually solving problems like this. I got really interested in all of these problems because I happened to be one of those people that was kind of between different roles. I started off doing user interface design. I got interested in how to actually turn that into running code. So I got into programming. And as soon as I had one foot in both of those different worlds, and I saw all of the different difficulties and the gaps and disconnects between those different areas. And then I was very lucky to spend these 17 years where I was part of the core team, first at 37 Signals and then Basecamp, and well, actually they're now called 37 Signals again. But in any way, the core team was the same. And we had this amazing luxury of having a small number of people who were really dedicated to doing trial and error and figuring out how to deal with these different problems and to come up with a different way of working so that we don't have those problems. And after quite a few years of figuring out what worked and what didn't together, I formalized that in this book, which is called Shape Up, that came out in 2019. And what I would like to do today is give you 3 kind of key ideas from Shape Up that you can use to start to think a little bit differently about the way that you're working. And then I want to give you some hints about how you can apply that in real life. And especially from the role here, a lot of people here are more in the individual contributor role than in the founder or the VP role or something like that. But it doesn't mean that there aren't opportunities for us to start to see how we can make changes and how we can use some of these things going forward into our careers. So I want to give you some hints about that as well. So the first thing that I want to talk about is this notion. It's one of the key ideas from Shape Up, and the idea is the difference between an estimate and an appetite. And very simply, an estimate is something that we all know, and Well, we have a difficult relationship with estimates. I don't have to tell you about that, right? The idea of an estimate is that you have a piece of work. We have to build X, right? This is what we're going to build. How long will it take? So we start with a design, and then we try to measure the time, right, of how long that's going to take. And it usually turns out to be wrong, of course, right? When we talk about an appetite, this is where we flip this around completely. And instead of starting with the concept or starting with the solution and then saying how long will it take in terms of time, we start with the time. And we say, how much time do we want to spend strategically on this? How much time is it worth? How much time do we have before we're going to have to stop working on it and move on to the next thing, right? So taking that time as the fixed thing and then saying, what are the different design solutions we could come up with that would fit inside of that time? So the solution, it's not like there's the solution and we have to build it exactly like that. No, we get into this thing which you've maybe heard this term, fixed time variable scope. It means that the scope actually becomes part of the design, right? I love giving this example because it's so easy to relate to. The example is building a calendar. And the reason it's such a good example is it's easy to see on the surface how much potential scope there is in a calendar, right? A calendar has month views and day views and maybe figuring out overlapping times and conflicts and all kinds of the week view and, dragging interactions. There's so many things there if we just say calendar. And we had a time once at Basecamp where customers were requesting us, they were asking us to build a calendar, and we understood from a strategic standpoint, this was not the central thing that we should be working on for the next 6 months. It was a small number of customers who kept asking again and again. It was not strategically a big thing, but it would be really nice if we could finally do something about it, right? And what we understood was we were willing to spend 6 weeks to make those customers happy and stop having to deal with this request for a calendar inside the product. But we were not willing to let this explode out of control and mean we don't do anything else because this calendar project is a monster, right? So what we had to do is we had to ask ourselves, if we only have 6 weeks, out of all of this potential scope, which parts of what we call calendar are actually the things that would be helpful, that would be part of this project, that we would say yes to, and what are all the different things that we could eliminate? And we came up with this concept which was fitting for our understanding of what customers were trying to do, what they weren't trying to do, how this calendar fit into the product at that time. And we came up with this very small subset. It's a 2-up monthly grid with an agenda view below. We had a little bit of an understanding of what those interactions look like between there. But the key thing was that we were able to say, because we only have 6 weeks, we need to be able to define something where we know when we look at it, yes, I can tell you the 10 moving parts that make this work. I can tell you day 1, day 2, day 3, how far along we should be able to be, because I can see how this thing works. It's small enough that I can get my arms around it, I can wrap my head around it, and I can say, yes, this design fits into that time box. And this is what we ended up shipping. So the high fidelity, by the way, was not the beginning of the project. This was the end. Yeah, so there was no Figma file, but we can also talk about that later. The second thing I want to share with you is this notion of shaping, and especially the idea of a shaping session. For every team, there is some phase of work where we have to figure out what is it that we're going to do, and that has to somehow get described, right? Whether it's rough sketches or whether it's the Figma file or it's a bullet list of requirements, there's some phase of figuring out what is that thing that we're going to do next. And when we look at how this is happening inside of a lot of teams today, we see those two extremes that I hinted at earlier. The first extreme, we could call it like undershaping, where there isn't enough detail there. We're saying, yeah, it would be great to have a report or it would be great to have a dashboard. But what does report mean? What does dashboard mean? When are we done? And what do we have to actually build to make that work? We don't know. So what happens is, of course, we start the project and then we're scrambling to have all kinds of discussions about scope and what's in and what's out and what trade-offs to make when it's too late, right? And the project drags on. Same thing with the other extreme. Overshaping is where we put in too much into the beginning, and especially too much on the surface, right? So every single pixel was carefully labored over by the designer, but it might turn out that the whole component that they drew isn't even possible, or doesn't make sense given the libraries that we're using, or doesn't fit with the architecture, or whatever it is, right? So it's the wrong effort being put in at the wrong time. Now, there is a place and time for making everything beautiful, right? But when we get these, I don't have to tell you, you've probably had the experience, right? Of having this perfect artwork up front and then saying, actually, I'm sorry, but we have to throw some of this away, or we have to change it. We can't just use it the way that it's drawn here. And when we look at what's happening here, when we get a perfect rendering, it's not just that we have too much of the superficial detail. Actually, important things are missing from these drawings. So if we imagine that we are interior designers and we have a beautiful rendering of what the new living room should look like, and one piece of this is this lamp. There's going to be this lamp here, right? And maybe the designers, they really spent days and days figuring out what is the exact lamp, yeah? And what is the color of the lamp, and how does it match everything else that's there? And we have maybe even a 3D rendering, and we're sure the lamp is perfect, right? But the question that we need to be asking if we're going to build this is, do we actually have electricity in that spot on the wall, right? And if we don't have electricity there, what does that do to the budget? What does that do to the timeline? Now, if we can't expand the budget and make a new hole in the wall and put new electricity lines so that we can put that lamp in that place, then do we have other ideas, right? How will we change the design knowing this, right? So this is, and especially since we are here mainly among technical people and people who are coding, this is very, very valuable to bring in early to the process, because it's finding these things out too late that causes so much of the struggle, both in our work process and also in our connections and our relationship between the other functions on the team, like product and business and stuff like that. So how do we actually spot things like this earlier? Well, it has to do with how we actually shape the work. How do we actually come up with the definition of what's in the project? So not asking the designers, give us the rendering, and then we're ready to start, right? Not just saying, let's get the bullet points on a requirements list, and then having a long, terrible, asynchronous discussion about what this thing is and isn't. I don't know if you've been a part of these things, but they're not very fun, right? In Confluence or Notion or whatever. And the worst thing about these is that everyone has the illusion that we all agreed. But because we were just typing on our own time, asynchronous from everyone else, we never had to wrestle with each other. We never had to align with each other and say, is that really what you mean? If we do that, does it mean that this is going to work or not, right? So we all think, wonderful, it's working as it is, but it doesn't actually come together, right? So what we do instead is have live working sessions. So a live work session means we come together in a room, and we don't pass a document back and forth, and we don't just say, give it to the designers to draw, but we push each other and ask the hard questions. And here we can have the different functions in a room, which all play an important role when we're shaping a project. So that means actually, number one, the technical person. Because the technical person is the only person who knows what we actually can build and not build, right? And when we're talking about what is in a project, knowing how our existing systems are built and what is cheap and what is expensive and what is possible and not possible, given the technical realities, this is an essential part of project definition. It's not just something to come later. So we have that. We have the person who is thinking about the experience. And when I say experience, I don't mean doing research for 3 weeks and then giving you 50 pages of documents and telling you about personas and you still don't know what to do. I mean someone who is really understanding what customers are trying to do, where they are, what they're struggling with, when are we done in terms of actually serving their need with this feature or this project that we're doing, right? So understanding what the customer is trying to do, having that kind of design perspective, and then of course someone who is aware of cost and time and how this fits into other things that are going on in the company, and having that kind of business perspective on what we're doing. So it means wrestling together. And it looks like this. Let's say that we're in a shaping session and it's 2 to 3 hours. And we understand why we want to build this thing, but now we're figuring out what might we actually do together. So if the technical person is there in the room, then when a product person says, hey, we have this idea, it's so simple. We're just going to skip this step in onboarding, right? Because we have data from a partner and we think we can improve conversion, blah, 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 right? We're just going to skip this step. Easy. And right here and right then, the technical person can say, let's actually have a look at when you say this step, what is that in the code, actually? And they could right then and there open the laptop, go to the repo, have a look, and say, what you're calling one step is actually 3 different states with different branching conditions depending on the segment of the customer and where their origin was from and blah, 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 right? You've probably seen things like this in many projects that you've worked on, right? It's more complicated than it seemed, right? These are the kind of things that we can surface on day 0 before we even kick off the project, right? By having a live work session together. I don't want to give you any illusions about how beautiful and polished this looks. We're so used to creating artwork or documents or things like that. But this is what the end of a real shaping session looks like that I had last week. It looks like a mess. And it doesn't mean very much to anybody who wasn't there. But for those who were there, we clearly articulated, this, and this. These are the moving parts and the components and the architecture we can use to get this thing done. And if we actually package that into some kind of a, let's say, cleaner form, which can survive time and passing on to other people, you can see something like this. We see all the main relationships, the architecture, the whole concept is there without wasting time on, this is the exact color of the tile in this corner of the kitchen or something like that. So the third thing I want to talk about briefly is team autonomy. And a huge part of why we struggled when I was working together with the people at Basecamp to figure this out and then to formalize it was because we wanted the opposite of that calendar we saw before, right? Where there was no time to think. It was about how do we actually create a situation where the 80% of our time, 90% of our time, what is, let's say, normal at work is nobody is bothering me, I have an interesting problem, and I have time to think about it, right? I can code. I like writing code, I can code. And I don't have to stop what I'm doing and lose my context and break my train of thought to go have a meeting that doesn't actually have a purpose, right? So how do we enable that? It comes back to the paper shredder. We need an alternative to the paper shredder. So if we've gone through shaping, we have identified both the technical and the design aspects. We've got a concept that makes sense. Now, instead of putting that through the paper shredder and saying, now we're going to create tickets and we're just going to knock on this thing week after week after week, we can give ownership for the whole project. So instead of assigning tickets, assigning the project. And because we've actually shaped the project, it's not just a drawing and now we have to figure out what it means. We've already done the work of figuring out what it means in terms of the technical backing and the architecture and so on. When we have that packaged work, now we have something that we can take as a team that allows us to own that work. And this has 2 really important aspects. One is the context. There's no, single little piece of work where we finish it, but it doesn't add up to anything else, right? All of the work is there as a whole where it's all connected. So the team themselves, when they're working in this kind of a way, creates their own tasks or doesn't, right? They figure out their own way of tracking if the individual little things get done, but the map of what's in the territory, right? The map of this is what we're going to build as a whole is there. And we can understand where are we in the totality of this concept, right? So the context is there, and especially to make those hard trade-offs. If we start to run out of time, if something is a little bit harder than we thought, then it's less about the commitment to do this one task, and it's more about we're trying to get this overall thing done. What are our options, right? So we get to be creative and use our brains. And the other aspect of this is what we can call latitude. And here, latitude means like freedom. How much freedom, how much space is there to interpret what's written, and how much room do we have to be creative and make our own decisions? If everything is defined in the Figma file, then there's no freedom. You just have to do what's there, right? And on the other hand, if there's a very fuzzy picture of we just need to build a report, we just need to build a dashboard, and we have to figure out, well, what does report mean? What does dashboard mean? Then it's like we don't even have any borders, right? So we don't even know what to do. So, but if we have a rough sketch like something like this, then we can say, aha, as we encounter the real trade-offs and decisions, then we can deal with those, and we can be creative, and we can come up with solutions inside the time that we have. So those are the main three things I wanted to tell you about. You might already have some objections or questions, but I wanted to just kind of feed you with a couple basic things. If you've heard about ShapeUp, actually, first this. Many people ask, well, how do I deal with bugs and all those little things that come up all the time? If we're going to be focused on one piece of shape work for 6 weeks and just only doing that and enjoying our concentration, but how do we deal with the bugs? And the answer is tickets are fantastic for that kind of work. So if there's urgent work, if there's a problem and someone else is waiting and they need, marketing is blocked, and until we do this thing, they can't launch the new campaign, right? Or this customer has an urgent crisis. That's exactly what tickets are for. And that's why all help systems are based off of the concept of a ticket, right? So if we have either dedicated time or dedicated capacity or dedicated team, there's different ways depending on the scale of our org and what we have to work with. But basically, this is a different kind of animal. It's a different kind of work, and it deserves a different process. We don't have to shoehorn all projects into tickets, and we also don't have to shoehorn all projects into a ShapeUp kind of a structure either. We can say that for tickets, some kind of a Kanban or something like that is great, and for planned strategic project work, for this, we can have these shaping sessions, and we can block off 6 weeks of time or 4 weeks of time and say, that's what we're going to work within, and that's what we're going to ship at the end of. The book talks about this magical number 6 over and over again. One thing that I have learned since working with a lot of teams outside of Basecamp is that the number 6 isn't holy at all. There are some very nice things if you can manage to do a 6-week time box. There are some advantages, but actually the real key thing is to internalize this notion of fixed time variable scope. If we are able to commit to a time box, whatever it is, and say 6 weeks, 4 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever that time box is, and then shape into that, finish and ship at the end of that, that's amazing, right? And the exact number of weeks is less important. And then the third and last thing that's a common objection is, well, how do we actually do big projects? You can't just take a new product or a really complicated new feature area and squeeze it into one 6-week cycle. And the question comes up a lot, so that's why I mentioned it here. But it's as simple as, well, we don't have to do that. You know, it's more about being able to define a specific outcome. Here's some meaningful chunk of this work, and we can say what done means for this chunk, and now we have a way to shape it, build it, and ship it, and really finish something and then move on to the next thing. So as a tip, I would just say, if you start to look into ShapeUp, don't think of it as a sacred book that you have to do everything that's in there. It's just a framework. And just like a technical framework, you choose what you want out of it and you use it to make things that suit your needs, right? And lastly, I want to mention a couple opportunities where you can use this. I can't tell you how many times I've heard from CTOs and founders, I heard about ShapeUp because my senior engineer told me about it. So this is actually as an individual contributor, just being the person who knows about it can actually be a big help to an organization. And then there's 3 places in particular where people really get interested and they say, I want to know more. The first is if the business feels as a whole that they're struggling to move forward on the things that are important. Too many projects have been taking too long and we can't keep working like this, right? So that's when people will start to listen. Another case is when the way that we're working is actually fine, but there's no structure to it, right? And when we're small and we don't have any structure, it's totally fine. But as we start to grow, we discover this isn't going to be sustainable, right? And we need some kind of a structure, and maybe the team doesn't want Scrum for that. And finally, as a contributor, if you feel like you're bored in the position you're in, and you feel like, well, I would like to be able to interact more with product people or business people, or have more of an influence on the decisions we make with our strategy, understanding all the glue between these different phases of work puts you in a very good position where you can start to have more meaningful interactions with people in other parts of the company. So those are a few ideas for things to look out for where you could start to use these things. If you want to learn more, then you can go to my website and you'll find that you can read the book for free. You can see a lot of articles about what has changed, what we've been learning through a lot of teams applying this over the last couple of years. There's also the course Shaping in Real Life, which is kind of how to actually get the skills to do this with a real team. And I would love to hear from you about your experiences or answer your questions. So feel free to get in touch on LinkedIn or write me an email or whatever. I would be very happy to hear how things are from your side and clarify anything. And we also have a little bit of time here for questions. So I would love to use these 15 minutes that we have to see what's in your head. So please, let's have some questions if you have any.